as a survivor of America's Revolutionary War. And if it could talk, surely some of the greatest stories would be told. This survivor repelled the elements and several military campaigns to keep General Washington and his commanders safe and dry. It's George Washington's tent, and we learn more about the life and struggle of this fated fabric and cook up some fantastic meals along the way. We'll be making a lentil stew with rabbit and venison sausage, followed by a pot-au-feu, translation pot and fire, a rutabaga and collard greens ragu, and we're finishing it off with George Washington's famous whiskey cake, as we give you a taste of history. So the first recipe today is a lentil stew. And lentils, like so many legumes, were very popular in the 18th century. The reason for this, they traveled extremely well in burlap bags. The only thing to remember, if you're trying to make this recipe at home, and by the way, this is a very popular dish. Where I come from, the Black Forest, lentils are eaten at least once a week, guaranteed. You have to soak the lentils overnight so that they swell up, because you could not cook them from the dry stage straight on. Now today's recipe is unique in itself that it uses rabbit. I have some nice baby rabbits right here, and all I'm going to do is just chop them up in any piece. There's really no right, no wrong. It depends how you like it. Now rabbit is readily available to any butcher. For today, I'm just cutting it in like 8 to 10 pieces, and you take the entire rabbit into it because it's also for the flavor. So now I'm just going to put a little salt on this rabbit, pepper, and I have a dachi already getting hot behind me. This is schmaltz with crackling underneath. Crackling is pigskin. Okay, so now we want to get this pot nice and hot. So now the rabbit goes in, the pan is nice and warm. You don't want to have too much heat in there because we're going to literally cook the rabbit 80% done, and then we add the lentils into it. Now we add some bacon into it, and the bacon that I have has the skin on it. The skin we're not going to discard. Trim the skin off, and the skin goes right into the rabbit in the back in a second. Then I take the bacon and chop it down. So I'm going to add the bacon into the rabbit right now. Now what I got to do is chop a few onions, a little garlic, a little carrot, add it all into it, top it off with the lentils, and let it cook. So chop the onion, just coarse chop. Some garlic, coarse again, nothing fine. Carrot, I'm just going to add a little bit of carrot in there for the flavor, nice and sweet. And you can just cut it either you like it. A dice is fine, a julienne is fine. It's your preference, whatever you like. And now I want to get a couple of potatoes. And the potato I'll just cut in a dice. There we go. Just for the seasoning, some bay leaf. I'm lucky I got fresh ones today, and a little bit of thyme. And it all goes in. But first, I want to deglaze the rabbit a little bit because I want to make sure the rabbit is nice and tender before I add anything else into it. So I take a little white wine and then some stock. I'm ready to add all my vegetables, potato, the bay leaf, and the thyme. You watch my show many times, you see me cooking with fresh herbs. Today I'm cooking on a campsite for George Washington. Fresh herbs during the winter time would not be available, so the dry thyme will equally work. And now basically I'm ready, the rabbit is ready to go. Add all this into the pan. I want to put the landing. The flavor is unbelievable. So now the lentils, you have to really soak them overnight. You could not cook them from a dry stage, impossible. So you add the lentils into it. You could add water or a stock. In my particular case, I have a little beef stock that I have made before. I add beef stock into it. Now I'm going to stir this whole thing up. It's going to take about half an hour or so to cook. Basically, the dish is done when the lentils are completely starting to disintegrate. I transferred from my braising pot into the stewing pot, very important. And now all I want to make sure, I check now on the spices, make sure the salt is right, make sure the pepper is right, and then I let it simmer away. Oh, fantastic. Really, really great. So the last thing I got to do is get my beautiful venison sausage that is smoked. I'm going to cut up some pieces of it on a bias, like so. So look at how beautiful those lentils are disintegrated. Get a piece of rabbit in it. Put my smoked venison sausage on top. So my lentil stew with rabbit and the smoked venison sausage is a spectacular, spectacular flavor. And I'm sure our troops were able to win the war with food like that. Washington utilized his headquarters at Valley Forge during most of the 6-month encampment of 1777 and 1778. But his sleeping arrangements were much less accommodating for the rest of his military campaign. Since the Revolutionary Army needed to be mobile, military officers, like the rest of the troops, slept and dined in large, sturdy cloth tents referred to as marquees.
During the Revolutionary War, Washington had a company of men known as the Commander-in-Chief's Guard, sometimes known as the Life Guard.
While they were supposed to protect my life, well, their major role was to protect headquarters. There were a goodly number of individuals, nigh on 125 of them.
They were really Secret Service detail and household staff for Washington during the Revolutionary War.
Setting up the marquees was one of the many responsibilities held by the Life Guard. And for the remainder of the campaign against the British, these tents served as Washington's mobile headquarters for the Continental Army.
The tents are composed of flax linen, specially woven so that it will shed water easier. There's fine woven wool binding that's dyed red that prevents the fraying of the edges of the linen. There are hundreds of little hooks and eyes, little fasteners that all had to be individually constructed from iron wire and bent to shape. And then the tent poles, which are composed of a tropical hardwood, mahogany. A lot of thought went into this. A commander-in-chief needs a quiet place to think. Of the two tents, the smaller marquee was his sleeping and office tent. When we started to read how Washington would use this office tent, the images that popped into my head were very familiar ones. John F. Kennedy in the Oval Office during the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Bush after 9/11.
You know, it was from this tent that the operations for the Continental Army were conducted. And this is where I would meet members of Congress. This is where I would meet foreign dignitaries. And so there was a lot of activity besides the fact that I slept here.
Thinking about the role of the Oval Office for a commander-in-chief, and certainly when you think about the emotions that Washington must have felt, made me start thinking, was this the first Oval Office?
Now we're going to start the next recipe, which I'm sure would have been served many, many times on many campsites. Not only General Washington, everybody. Let's talk about the protein that would have been in a pot-au-feu. It would literally be whatever they get their hands on. A beef short ribs, marrow bone, lamb shanks. That's where the name comes from. Pot on fire, pot-au-feu. Whatever you find, you throw it in there and you boil it or simmer it, depending. You don't want to overcook it completely. On a separate pot, you're going to put whatever you're going to serve with it. I got some bay leaf and a chopped onion that I'm going to add into the water. Pig foot, some short ribs, or any kind of beef you can get your hands on. A couple lamb shanks. And most important for the good flavor, a couple of marrow bones. Throw a few small baby carrots right in there. So I'm gonna cut up some potatoes real quick. whatever they would have found at the time would have gone along with the pot-au-feu. I'm going to put this right into my boiling water behind me. I have carrots, I got an onion, mostly all root vegetables. You cut it in big chunks. Root vegetables would be the whatever you could find. Envision unkempt cooking. There wouldn't be any finesse. It was hearty. They were also pretty intelligent. They knew what would work together. Now, the rutabaga, you want to peel the outside off, like so. In the 18th century, they would take the rutabaga and many other vegetables for that matter and wax it. So it almost became like a preservative. And rutabaga, if you never had it, it's just a beautiful flavor of a vegetable. Now I'm going to throw this all into my stock behind there. And now all we're going to do, we're going to cut a Savoy cabbage. I have a beautiful head of Savoy cabbage. The reason I like to use it is because it's my favorite 18th century mentor's favorite cabbage, which is Thomas Jefferson. Just take out the core and do it right on top of your other vegetable that you already have on your stock. As soon as the cabbage is wilted, we're ready to serve up the meal. Salt, pepper, that's all it takes. All right. So in some of my research, I also found that a lot of times all the vegetables would have been cooked together with the rest of the protein. However, I just think it would be, in our days, not acceptable because by the time the protein is done, the vegetable would not be looking really pretty. There are many moments in the Taste of History that are truly memorable. This happens to be one, especially that I get to cook for General Washington. All the protein is cooked nicely. Obviously the marrow bones are really highly priced. And I have the beautiful lamb shank. Look how nice they are. When you cook the lamb shank, you can see how the meat pulls nicely back. Pig leg right here. Have my short ribs. All right. A little bit of the stock over it, because there's all the goodness in there. All I would do, which I know would have not happened during the days of General Washington on a camp, but I can help myself to put a little bit of fresh parsley over it. I hope you forgive me, General Washington. So the troops on the march, whatever they could find, wherever they were, whether near a farm or near a forest, whatever they would get would be caught and thrown in a pot, henceforth pot-au-feu, pot on fire, any kind of wood vegetables, whatever they get their hands on, basically boiled all the way down, but it's a serious eating, good protein and filling for the troops. I miss this era.
In June of 1778, George Washington had a set of tents, or marquees, delivered to him for use as a mobile headquarters in the campaign against the British. These tents have an intricate history, outliving the Revolution and even well beyond the American Civil War.
They were purchased upon the death of Martha Washington in 1802 by Martha Washington's grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. He built the house known as Arlington, overlooking Washington, D.C. At the time of the Civil War, Arlington, overlooking Washington, was occupied by federal troops. There was another really important reason in the minds of federal troops to seize that ground, and that is because Arlington had become the home of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, who had married the daughter of George Washington Parke Custis, Mary Anna Randolph Custis Lee.
Many at the time believed the Civil War wouldn't last more than 90 days. In 1861, it became clear to all that the conflict would only grow more dire. Mary Anna Randolph Custis Lee left her home, understanding the strategic value of Arlington House to the Federal Army, but not before locking away the invaluable Washington family relics in the basement.
Soldiers started picking the locks and getting into some of the rooms.
When federal soldiers discovered these historical relics, the tents were moved to Washington, D.C. for safekeeping.
They remained in federal custody until they were returned to the children of Robert E. Lee and Mary Anna Randolph Custis Lee in 1901 during the McKinley administration. So a very, very long time. And now we have the original tent on display in Philadelphia at the Museum of the American Revolution. And so that will be available to the American people after all this time.
When I researched all those many meals that were served in many different campsites, when there was no protein available or very little protein like bacon, they would do dishes with different root vegetables. Hannah Glass calls it raguing it. What raguing means, it's tying it up with some cream or with the sauce bechamel. And so basically all we're going to do, we're going to chop some onions coarse. Onions would have been always available because they would winter extremely well. I have some schmaltz over here. Put schmaltz in my pot. This is schmaltz with a little bit of creaminess in there. You want a good heat there because you want to get good flavor on the onion. Remember, you're not getting any other flavors into it, so basically this is your flavoring process. I got a little bit of garlic in there, and I have the onion, and I have the schmaltz. Let me move this back just a tad. I'm going to chop the potatoes quick. Potatoes right in. I'm going to chop up a little bit of the root vegetable, whichever you prefer. So just take some rutabaga. The rutabagas, we're going to cut them a little finer because they're more firm than the regular potato. Sweat down a little bit. Add a little bit of water into it. You could also, if you want to make this at home, deglaze them with some white wine. But I'm sure on the camp they wouldn't put the wine for cooking, most likely for drinking. Salt and pepper, freshly ground in here. If they would have the opportunity to have some bacon, now would be a perfect time to add it. Bacon, again, preserved extremely well. The skin we're going to put right into the potato mixture for extra flavor. And then the bacon, depending how much bacon they add, you would cut it small, you would cut it big. You don't need a slab bacon like I'm using here, but this one just gets tremendous flavor. Now the potato at high heat really cooks quickly. Put some heavy cream. So now we're going to put some bechamel into it. Bechamel is very simple. It's just basically white roux with cream, flour, equal part. Cook it all together. I mean, this is unbelievable. Two things I got to do now. So the nutmeg in here. It doesn't get better than that. I'm not so sure if everybody on the camps would have had nutmeg, but I'm sure General Washington had the means to have it, and I know he loved it a lot, so. I'm gonna mix this all up. It's unbelievable. Now the greens, what I like to do is just pull a little bit, like big pieces, like so. Put it back on the fire. Never use the stem, because the stems are too tough, too hard. Just like that. Any greens will work. Actually, even romaine you could use for just a little bit of color, a little bit of flavor. That's really all it takes. So I'm gonna take it back, give it 1 second, literally a second, to wilt. Oh. The flavor of the potatoes, the flavor of the rutabaga, a little bit of flavor of the greens. What can I describe? Spectacular. Really, really good. Diana, now it's an exciting moment. We're making the George Washington's favorite whiskey cake. We know that General Washington really liked it. And it's made today with his actual recipe for the rye whiskey that he made 11,000 gallons worth in 1797, imagine. So take me through.
Okay, it's a little bit of an involved recipe, but that's all right. I actually started yesterday with our fruit here. We have dried crystallized ginger, candied lemon peel, candied orange peel, dried cherries, raisins, both light and dark, shredded coconut, and slivered almonds. And that's been soaking overnight. and George Washington's whiskey, of course. So we will start with our dry. This is bread flour. This is a little bit of a heavy recipe with all the soaked fruit and everything, so the bread flour really helps it stay together.
Extra gluten.
Exactly. So in here, we're just gonna whisk in our spices. 2 teaspoons approximately of clove, allspice, a little extra ginger. We'll go with a tablespoon of ginger. And if you would grind some nutmeg in here for me, just a little bit.
Because the 18th century uses nutmeg so many times in so many recipes. And again there, remember, never ever buy pre-ground nutmeg.
So good with the spices. Now we're just gonna add a teaspoon of salt, 2 teaspoons of baking soda, and a tablespoon of baking powder. This is basically the easy way to sift. It's just so that everything really gets among the flour.
Beautiful incorporated. Yep.
Precisely. So now we'll move over to our wet, traditional cake method. We need 9 eggs. There's 8 in there. Get 1 more. Fantastic. I'm just gonna break the yolks, get that started a little bit before we add our brown sugar and honey. 2 cups of brown sugar. Right in. Make sure there's no lumps in your brown sugar. Now we need a 1/4 cup of honey.
1/4 cup of honey, yes, coming up.
Delicious. Our good local honey.
There we go.
Perfect. Make sure everything's incorporated so that our oil goes in easily. It's 2 cups of olive oil. Excellent. Beautiful.
If you're trying to make this cake at home, you might want to try it a couple times before you invite guests over.
That is true. The last thing is just a smidge of vanilla, about 1.5 teaspoons. Wet into dry. Beautiful. This is a very traditional cake with a very loose batter, which is perfectly fine. The bread flour really helps to add stability to it, and also it's just that kind of cake. So we'll just get this good and incorporated.
The aroma that comes out of the batter already, it's amazing.
Nice.
Think about it.
Now, of course, they wouldn't have been making this on the battlefield.
Never.
Absolutely not.
Somebody would have made it and it got transported into the battlefield. But we know for a fact that he was fond of it. No question about it. He was as fond of that as he was of, do you know what it is?
Tell me.
It was hickory nuts.
Oh.
And he was known to nibble on hickory nuts all night long. And obviously drink some of his whiskey, I would assume.
Great. Let's continue on with the cake. Apricot preserves. So I'm going to add this in along with our macerated fruit. Most of the liquid has been absorbed, and any extra will just add some wonderful flavor in there. I don't want to leave any bits behind. Look how beautiful. All the colors and the fragrance is incredible. Everything's coming together now. Perfect. And that is exactly what you want. This would absolutely fill your 9x13 standard pan. Today we're going to use our 10-inch round, which has been greased, and with a little piece of parchment in the bottom. With such a wet batter, there's definite possibility of sticking. This goes into a 325-degree oven for 45 minutes to an hour, and then you just want to make sure it'll be a little bit spongy on top. You'll know it's done when it's golden brown and beautiful. It will be very dark. Here we have the cake out of the oven.
Put a little bit more of George Washington's original rye whiskey on top. When you study the 18th century as well as I study it, you know they would make this 3-4 months before the holiday season, and then every couple of weeks sprinkle a bit more. If it's whiskey, it evaporates out of it, but the flavor stays with it.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's beautiful, and what's nice about it is the moisture. By all accounts, the winter of 1777 in Valley Forge was a really harsh one. So a fruit cake like that would most likely make it a little bit more bearable. Thanks, Diana. Fantastic job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, there has been a great deal of work done today, and my lifeguard has performed in a yeoman fashion, setting up this headquarters encampment. I understand, Chef, that you have been rather hard at work as well.
Yes, I prepared for you a lentil stew with rabbit and venison sausage, a pot-au-feu, root vegetables, and your favorite whiskey cake that Mother made for you all the time.
Are you soldiers hungry?
Yes, Your Excellency.
Chef, let us eat.
all for a taste of history.